Think like a medical doctor. Welcome to the Fresh Thinking Business School. How do doctors think? The masterclass is inspired by the book How Doctors Think, written by Dr. Jerome Groopman. In this myth-shattering work, Dr. Groopman explores the forces and thought processes behind doctors' decisions. The purpose of the masterclass is to present the overview window into the physician's mind and an insightful examination of the all-important relationship between doctors and their patients. To take on a journey on how doctors think, to share theories about thinking and methods, to discuss the ethics of practice in medicine, the importance of continuous education and practice in the medical field, a complete understanding of how doctors think, a theory of medicine's clinical rationality can exist side by side in the same person with the presumption of certainty, but they are not available simultaneously. Physicians do not analyze their practice and act at the same time. Those who have worked out the uncertain status of medical knowledge and its differences from positivist clinical judgment and the nature of medical science nevertheless remain subject as practitioners to clinical medicine's ethical demands. We must conclude that medicine's moral imperative to act on the patient's behalf is so strong and thoroughly embedded in clinical habit and predisposing to override mere ideas about their knowledge. The face-to-face encounter with a patient, the power of one's peers, and the habits of perception and knowing ingrained by a long apprenticeship all compel the physician's clinical attention to the patient and call for the exercise of practical reason in this case. Edmund Pellegrino's intolerant dismissal of postmodernism makes sense in this context. For example, he justifies it with the old saw, and I quote, "There are no atheists in foxholes." For physicians, the ethics of practice always trumps the epistemology, clinical medicine. However, this triumph goes towards accounting for medicine's blindness to its rationality and explains why so little about its actual workings are included in medical education. Such neglect otherwise makes no sense. The practical balance. The practical balance of scientific and experiential knowledge in medicine is, after all, the overriding, if implicit, lesson of clinical education. It is the goal of every case presentation and the aim of the long, closely overseen clinical apprenticeship. Why not also teach about it? Why not admit phronesis, the practical epistemology of clinical medicine, as a legitimate field for investigation by physicians and medical students? The answer, in part, is that the current way of doing things works, implicit or declared. The belief that medicine is a science remains valid as an ideal for physicians and patients, especially since, given the practice ethics, it is seldom put unwaveringly into action. Instead, it endures unexplained and untested as an object of faith. Meanwhile, despite frequently disheartened students, dehumanized residents, burnt out physicians, dissatisfied patients, and stories about casual cruelty and absolute neglect for most of us. Most of the time, the medicine works its miracles. Most days, for most of us, it isn't too broken. There are reasons and solid arguments for not including medicine's practical epistemology in medical education and first describing it as a science. Even those physician educators who know well that clinical practice is characterized by uncertainty, agency, and imprecision. They may believe that only medicine's aspirations to be a science can promote uncertainty and enforce sound, rational procedures. Those who see clinical reasoning as inaccessibility in an unconscious way claim a necessity counterweight to what cannot describe. All these arguments value clinical balance and the safety of patients. Still, they fail to appreciate the authority inherent in clinical medicine, a charge based on the acts of attention and care, including the very performance of certainty in response to another human being's need. A more worrisome reason for ignoring medicine's practical rationality is the possibility that self-knowledge is incapacitating. This is the centipede problem. The belief that treatment cannot change and that it attempts to do so at its peril. The fear is that physicians, especially beginning ones, are like the centipede was asked to explain how it works. If they had to think about how they feel, they might, like the centipede, be unable to take another step. Physicians must act or decide not to work. For example, suppose the status of clinical knowledge and its pervasive uncertainty were well described and understood. In that case, thinking about thinking might make thought, or worse, effective action, impossible. We have come to doubt this. Intellectual knowledge, including a thorough grasp of clinical thinking, is always trumped by practice ethics. This is true even for someone like the surgeon writer who thinks and writes about medicine's uncertainty. They reassure us after a while that they are on something amazing, a path to clarity, critical and integrated knowledge. Thinking about our day conversation persuaded us to realize and recognize that self-understanding can and ought to change. It can change because physicians are intelligent and fully capable of a reflective understanding of their work. It ought to change because despite the hope and confidence conferred by their profession's identification with a simplistic conception of science, the costs of that identification are too high. Moreover, the claim that medicine is a positivist science entails undesirable side effects for all of us, physicians, society as a whole, above all, patients and also their families. Change without risking physicians' capacity to act. Beside medicine, can change without risking physicians' capacity to act. Far from being like the fabled centipede, they are in no danger of sacrificing their clinical method, their deeply ingrained clinical habits, to mere theoretical knowledge, no matter how interesting or persuasive. For physicians, the ethos of medical practice and physician authority in inpatient care are far more chronic and compelling than any understanding of their knowledge status. Physicians, if asked, often clinical judgment and the nature of medicine knowledge that clinical knowing is contingent and open to change. Only the customary irrelevance of thinking about it prevents their recognition of a gap between the profession's claim to be a science and the knowledge conditions of their actual practice. For those who recognize that gap, irony is the chief refuge. For other clinicians, there is the learned naivety that Pierre Bourdieu describes as characteristic of practice. This epistemological blind spot exists for the ironists too, whenever they put on the white coats. Consequently, there is no danger to patients or to the physicians themselves from understanding how doctors think, because medicine is not a science but a practice. Its pedagogy is directed towards that praxis rather than science, philosophy, psychology, or cognitive theory. Like human biology, medical students spend so long learning these other fields of knowledge, provide reference points for the prepared mind, but are not under immediate consideration. Students absorb the clinical habits and judgment necessary for patient care instead. If the medical profession asked its practitioners to think about how they think and to examine the claim to be a science and the role of that assumption in medical education, the clinical practice will not change. Profession-wide attention to clinical thinking will not challenge the acculturated blindness inherent in the practice, just as clinical decision-making and evidence-based medicine have not done so. Theories about thinking and methods. Theories about thinking and methods of knowing do not conflict with the ethics of medicine as a practice. They cannot. The ethics of patient care prevails. Ethics of practice. Although medicine's ethics of practice outweigh whatever philosophical understanding clinicians have about their knowledge, ethics is often undervalued in the discourse of medicine. The duties of a doctor registered with the General Medical Council. Patients must be able to trust doctors with their lives and health. To justify that trust, you must show respect for human life and ensure your practice meets your standards in 4 domains: knowledge, skills, and performance. Make the care of your patient your first concern. Provide a good standard of practice and care. Keep your professional knowledge and skills up to date. Recognize and work within the limits of your competence, safety, and quality. Take prompt action if you think that patient safety, dignity, or comfort is being compromised. Protect and promote the health of patients and the public. Communication, partnership, and teamwork. Treat patients as individuals and respect their dignity. Respect patients' right to confidentiality. Work in partnership with patients. Listen to and respond to their concerns and preferences. give patients the information they want or need in a way they can understand. Respect patients' rights to reach decisions with you about their treatment and care. Support patients in caring for themselves to improve and maintain their health. Work with colleagues in ways that best serve patients' interests, maintaining trust. Be honest and open and act with integrity. Never discriminate unfairly against patients or colleagues. Never abuse your patient's trust in you or the public's trust in the profession. You are personally accountable for your professional practice and must always be prepared to justify your decisions and actions. It is often ignored despite its force, perhaps because that force is inalienable from practice. Instead, medicine's inherent values, exercised in the care of patients and taught throughout clinical education, are overlooked in favor of appeals to science as a warrant for clinical habits and attitudes, even for clinical decisions. But the values of science cannot substitute for medicine's ethics of practice. Indeed, medicine's practice ethics call for exercise of clinical judgment in response to a client's need. It demands that physicians be thorough and carefully in their observations. This is not because they are scientists, but because they are physicians caring for human beings who are ill. The ethics of practice also calls for examining the currency and reliability of one's knowledge, not because this is a scientist's duty, but because it is the obligation of uncertainty. And all thinkers, historians, economists, and anthropologists, as well as physicians. Likewise, the ethics of practice value egalitarian openness, a characteristic so vital that institutions employing physicians put economic, triage, and financial gatekeepers between them and needy patients. Openness to all comers does not need scientific objectivity to justify it. It is part of medicine's identity as a profession. Practice ethics also encourages rigorous rationality and a commitment to continue learning, including an investigation of the reliability of the current knowledge, not because medicine is a science, but because its goal is good patient care. The ethics of practice also offers benefits that the ideal of science lacks. Moreover, it provides comfort and protection for patients by acknowledging the human connection part of clinical work and not dooming them to think only of disassociated body parts. Above all, it encourages the acceptance of uncertainty and an appreciation of well-informed, well-exercised clinical judgment. These values inherent in routine care of patients have shaped the methods used to teach clinical reasoning. In physicians' practical education, the virtues of honesty, attention, thoroughness, best effort, and skepticism are honed and rewarded. These are not virtues exclusive to science, but general intellectual ones. They belong to medicine long before there was much in biological sciences. Ideally, they are continually tempered and refined in beginning clinical students and experienced physicians alike. the importance of education and practice. Throughout education and practice, cases are undertaken and reviewed. Those narrative representations of clinical judgment essential to acts of care are a powerful embodiment of clinical medicine's practical values. Medicine's ethics of practice includes the importance of attentive care and a commitment to the continued refinement of clinical judgment. This is not science, but pragmatism motivated by the duty to do what is best for the patient. Although scientific discoveries will continue to provide more and more reliable information, clinical knowledge will remain unfinished and uncertain in clinicians' daily work. However sophisticated their biomedical information, doctors will still have to figure out what is going on with every patient. The interpretive task requires a flexible cast of minds, steady attention to practice methods, the habit of questioning, and a willingness to learn from others, observing, refining ideas, and comparing notes. Such habits of mind are part of the ethics of practice, essential to becoming a physician and maintaining one's abilities over a lifetime. Doctors may make clinical work feel like science, even though this inferential clinical method is shared with all investigators, not excluding historians, psychologists, and musicologists, and resembles that of naturalists more than laboratory scientists. Increased scientific knowledge will not change either clinical judgment and the nature of medicine. These procedures of clinical thinking or the values they represent, evidence-based medicine itself, the product of clinical commitment, and medicine's rational process has changed and challenged physicians to improve their clinical judgment with the use of more sophisticated statistical studies. Still, it has not displaced clinical medicine's fundamental, rational, interpretive method. There is no need to label such devotion to knowledge. Science, unlike its predecessors, evidence-based medicine has wisely avoided claiming it. Instead, it claims what is far more compelling: a curiosity about the universe of available information and a commitment to improving the individual clinical and clinician's practice. The ethics of practice in medicine. In medicine, the ethics of practice is so strong that physicians can understand how they think and work is unlikely to alter, much less impair, their clinical habits. Patient care comes first. For the clinician, theories of knowledge must serve a clinical purpose or they are unnecessary, probably not even on the mental horizon, however important they may be at other times. Uncertainty is my soapbox. Theories of knowledge are set aside. At the same time, the physician addresses the patient's needs. This is undoubtedly how an experienced clinician who had given much thought to the practice of medicine, who was convinced that its inalienability, uncertainty, could assure that someone may die or not. Key messages to help reduce or rectify cognitive errors. Patients should ask, what else could it be? Combating satisfaction of such bias and leading the doctor to consider a broader range of possibilities. Patients should ask, and I quote, is there anything that doesn't fit? Well, combating confirmation bias and again leading the doctor to think broadly. Patients should ask, is it possible I have more than one problem? Because multiple simultaneous disorders do exist and frequently cause confusing symptoms. Tell what you are most worried about, opening a discussion and leading either to reassurance if the worry is unlikely, or careful analysis if the worry is plausible. Retell the story from the beginning. Details that might be omitted in the initial telling may be recalled, or different wording or context may make clues more salient. A doctor's office is not an assembly line. Turning a doctor's office into an assembly line is a sure way to blunt communication, foster mistakes, and rupture the partnership between patient and physician. A doctor cannot think with one eye on the clock and another on the computer screen. But thinking doctors do need to allot their time wisely. Well-defined and straightforward problems can be addressed with clarity in 15 or 20 minutes. And a patient and family can leave the visit feeling informed and satisfied. Complicated problems cannot be solved in a rush. The inescapable truth is that good thinking takes time. Working in haste and cutting corners are the quickest roads to cognitive errors. I'm glad we journeyed together during this masterclass. We appreciate you coming over, and we promise that only the best content will ever be put on this platform. As part of your continuing education program, reflect on the following questions. What are the 3 key lessons you learned from this masterclass? What are the 3 specific actions you plan to take in the next 24 hours? How do you plan to implement what you learned in your professional and leadership roles from this masterclass? Signing off, Dr. Masasikani Mishak Kosa, the Director of Fresh Thinking Business School, the Thinking Futurist. Thank you.